She stood trembling in a long line of shivering women, the winter air biting through her thin clothes. Then the command came, sharp and unforgiving. Strip for inspection. The temperature was well below freezing. It was in that moment, amidst the cold and the fear, that a soldier did something that defied all expectation, something that should have been impossible in the theater of war. It was Bavaria, March 1945. The Third Reich was crumbling. A group of 40 German women, captured while fleeing the advancing Soviet forces, were being processed at a makeshift American checkpoint. These were not combatants. Most were nurses, factory laborers, or civilians swept up in the chaos of the front lines. Yet, they were German, and in the eyes of the law, that branded them as the enemy. Her name was Greta. She was 26 years old. For 3 days, she had been on a forced march with barely a scrap of food. Her clothing was torn, soiled by the road, and held together by little more than fraying threads and desperation. Now, she found herself standing in a frozen courtyard, encircled by armed American troops. A female officer was shouting commands, ordering them to strip down for delousing and a mandatory medical inspection. The women exchanged glances, their eyes wide with terror. They had heard the rumors, horrific stories about the fate of female prisoners, tales so dark they made death seem like a mercy. Greta's hand shook violently as she reached to unbutton her coat, not merely from the cold, but from sheer dread. Surrounding her, young male soldiers stood guard. Some averted their gaze, others did not. And that was what terrified her the most. But something was about to occur that Greta would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. A single soldier, a young private named Daniel Cooper from Tennessee, was preparing to break formation, an act of insubordination his sergeant would scream at him for later. The women began to undress slowly, steeped in humiliation. They were told it was protocol disease prevention, a medical necessity, but protocol has no regard for the fact that you are freezing, that you are paralyzed by fear, or that you are a human being. Greta removed her outer coat, then her sweater. The biting cold assaulted her skin instantly. March in Bavaria offers no kindness. She watched as an older woman, perhaps 50, began to weep silently as she removed her blouse. Another, barely 20, squeezed her eyes shut as if trying to will herself out of existence. Then, Greta noticed movement to her left. Private Daniel Cooper stepped forward. His sergeant bellowed at him to get back in line, but Daniel ignored the command. He walked directly toward Greta, keeping his eyes averted from her face, looking at nothing but the frozen ground beneath his boots. He unbuttoned his heavy military field jacket and dropped to one knee. He held the jacket out to her at arm's length, his gaze remaining fixed on the snow. "Ma'am," he said quietly, speaking English she did not understand, yet the gesture translated perfectly. Greta stared at him in disbelief. This American soldier, this enemy, was offering her his coat while she stood exposed, while his brothers in arms watched, and while his sergeant screamed for him to return to formation. She took it, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. The jacket was warm. It carried the scent of cigarettes, canvas, and safety. She wrapped it tight around herself and began to weep. But Daniel was not finished. He stood up, still refusing to look at the women, and turned to face his fellow soldiers. "Anyone else got a spare coat?" he asked loudly, his voice carrying a distinct challenge. The sergeant was red-faced, on the verge of exploding with rage. But then, another soldier, an older corporal named James, stepped forward. He removed his jacket. Then another followed, and then another. Within 2 minutes, 7 soldiers stood in the freezing cold, wearing only their undershirts, and 7 women had warm military jackets wrapped around their shivering frames. The female officer conducting the inspection was furious. "This is against protocol," she shouted. "They need to be inspected for lice, for disease." Daniel finally looked up, but he looked at her, not at the prisoners. "Then inspect them with dignity, ma'am," he replied. "They're people, not animals." What happened next was not written in any field manual. The inspection was moved indoors to a heated barracks. The women were permitted to undress one at a time behind a curtain, with only the female medical officer present. The male soldiers waited outside. Daniel was written up a formal reprimand for breaking formation and insubordination. He did not care. Greta kept that jacket for 3 hours until the inspection was concluded and her own clothes were returned, cleaned, and deloused. When she tried to return the coat, Daniel shook his head. "Keep it till you're warm," he said through a translator. She wore it for 2 more days while they were transferred to a proper prisoner of war facility. It saved her from pneumonia and perhaps from something far worse. Years later, in 1983, Greta wrote a letter to the U.S. Army attempting to locate Daniel Cooper from Tennessee. She simply wanted to thank him. The inquiry went through channels, old records, and veteran associations until they found him. He was 61, living in Knoxville, working as a mechanic. He did not remember her specifically. There had been so many prisoners, so much chaos in those final days. But he remembered that day. "I had a sister," he told the person who contacted him. "She was about their age. I just kept thinking, what if it was her standing there? What would I want someone to do?" Greta never met Daniel face to face, but she kept a photograph of herself wearing that jacket, taken by another prisoner who had possessed a smuggled camera. In the photo, she is not looking at the lens. She is looking down at the jacket, holding it closed tight. On the back, she wrote in the English she had taught herself, "The day I learned enemies can be kind." Here is what makes this story cut deep. That inspection occurred at dozens of camps, hundreds of times. It was standard procedure. Most of the time, no one stepped forward, not because the soldiers were evil, but because they followed orders, because protocol mattered more than mercy, because it was easier to look away. Daniel did not look away. He looked down, yes, to offer dignity, but he did not look away from the moment or from the choice. The lesson is not complicated. Dignity costs something. For Daniel, it cost a reprimand on his record. For those other 6 soldiers, it cost their warmth and potential punishment. But for Greta and those women, it cost nothing. It was freely given, and it changed everything. How many moments are we in right now where someone needs a jacket, and we are following protocol instead of our conscience? And maybe that is the part of history we forget too often. Wars do not end only with surrender papers or victory speeches. Sometimes they end in silence, in a shared meal, or in a small act of humanity no one expected. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, take 1 second right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. It tells the algorithm that these stories are worth sharing, because if we stop telling them, they disappear forever.